The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Youthful perspective on the all too long-standing problem of racism. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight on The Agenda in the Summer, writer Habiba Cooper Diallo on her book, #Black in School. School is supposed to teach you and prepare you for life. But what Habiba Cooper Diallo encountered certainly didn't do that in the way that anyone would be proud of. During her final 2 years in a Halifax high school, she kept a journal of her experience of racism, microaggressions, and violence. The book is called #Black in School. Habiba Cooper Diallo is a women's health advocate. She joins us now from Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's really nice to meet you.
Likewise, Nam, thank you for having me on your program.
So before we started, I was saying to you that when I was your age, the entries to my journal were about, boys and maybe not feeling like I belonged. But your journal has become a book that speaks to the times that we're in right now. What made you decide to keep a journal back then?
I've always kept a journal. So ever since I was about 12 years old, I've had a journal or a diary, if you will, just to document my thoughts, my feelings, my observations of the world. So it was completely normal that continuing on into high school, I still had a journal. And it just so happened that because of the experiences I was having at the time, my high school journal reflected a lot of those day-to-day interactions, that sort of day-to-day interfacing with racism.
And, high school is hard enough, but you actually moved from Ontario and you came to this high school in grade 10 in Halifax. And this school in particular was praised as the most diverse high school east of Montreal. But you didn't think so, huh?
Well, it was the case. It was very diverse in terms of the student population, the ethnic makeup of the student body. So that was very much true. However, I felt that it was just represented on a surface level. I wanted to see more in terms of the overall experience for students, in terms of the curriculum. So when it came to some of the deeper aspects of schooling and of education, I wanted there to be that diversity, which I felt wasn't there on a deeper level.
And that also included having more teachers of color, correct?
Exactly, yes.
Why is it important for schools, when we do talk about diversity or inclusion, that we're also talking about the makeup of the people who are doing the teaching?
Seeing is believing. Seeing is believing. That saying is very true. And seeing someone who looks like you in a position of authority or as a teacher, it can really inspire the students. It would, confirm the possibility for them that they can go on and achieve, that they can go on to higher education, become whatever it is they want to become, and just sort of move forward in society, fulfill their potential and become who they're meant to be.
So you're moving provinces, you're going into a new high school, but you're also dealing with a lot at home. What was happening at home during this time?
So I had just lost my father, actually, to a massive heart attack at the time. He died in 2010. And then a year later, in 2011, my family moved to Nova Scotia. So it was one of the most devastating times of my life. I was in complete and utter shock. And when I think back to that young person, to that girl I was then at about 15 years old, I think I'm just sort of in awe. I'm so amazed that I was able to do what I was able to do, that I was able to go through school, that I was able to achieve my goals and be so involved and be so courageous and be so outspoken, because you are right, it was such a difficult and trying time for me in my personal life.
My condolences for your loss.
Thank you.
I can imagine too that you everything must have felt raw at the time. So do you think that part of the experiences that you document in the book had to do with the fact that you were grieving?
I do, very much so. And I write in my introduction that perhaps had I not been grieving, some of what I experienced wouldn't have felt so abrasive. So the element of grief definitely shaped how I received so much of those experiences of racism, so much of that hostility. It definitely contributed to how I received them.
Well, let's get into what you experienced at school. You write, high school hurts the Black body. High school is hard enough on any young body. All students grapple with stress, lack of sleep, lugging heavy textbooks through icy Canadian winters and up and down stairs, and regular teen angst. But there's a whole other layer of constant and in some ways unseen violence that is done to young Black bodies in high school that needs to be recognized, because Black students must also deal with the racial stresses involved in going to school. Those non-standard parentheses are where, in parts, you added notes as an adult. What did you mean by the unseen violence to Black bodies?
The unseen violence. Okay, so some of those microaggressions, as we like to call them, and I'd argue that some of what we call micro is actually macro. But anyways, the looks, the sense of belonging or lack thereof, the curriculum, the constant whitewashing, as people call it nowadays. The denial of not being accepted, not feeling that you fully belong. That's some of the unseen violence, because these things aren't visible, but the repercussions are huge. The buildup, the accumulation is significant. So in that passage, that's what I'm getting at there.
How would you describe, you call them macroaggressions, but how would you define microaggressions?
The first thing that jumps to mind is when you live in a society that never acknowledges you, whether it's TV, whether it's media. You can watch a movie, you can watch a Hollywood film in 2022, and the entire cast can be white. This is coming out of Canada, this is coming out of America, that are supposedly plural societies. To me, that's violence. And then that sort of continues into school, when you go to school. And I think we also, in talking about this, have to realize that students spend so much time there, 5 days a week, 9 a.m. or 8:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. They spend more time there than they do with their parents. And then when some of that violence is perpetuated or repeated in school, we have to wonder what this does to the minds of Black students, to their bodies. And when I say bodies, I'm referring to the emotional body, the mental body, so their minds, their emotions, as well as their physical bodies. Because now we know there's the whole mental, physical connection, and sometimes what happens in our mind has a physiological impact, or our emotions, if we're dealing with certain stress, certain racial stresses, they can manifest themselves physiologically. That's how the violence expresses itself, this lack of being recognized, and you go through your whole life sort of there in that space, in a space that's supposed to be yours, especially for someone like myself who's born Canadian. We're born here, we're raised here. Some of us are second generation, third generation, because we had parents who came and they naturalized. Yet we're never fully accepted by white society, if I can call it that.
You explained in the book, there were several incidents where you wrote about where the school held an assembly or event, and on the surface, it looked like it was raising awareness, but it was reinforcing tropes about Black people. As one of the handful of a Black student at the school, how did this make you feel?
Yeah, I felt disappointed. Honestly, I don't think perhaps a little bit sad, or I don't know, offended, but more than anything else, I think I probably felt disappointed. I was just thinking, like, really, you couldn't present the issue in another way. You have to sort of harp on the perpetual tribal warfare, the famine, the gaunt and naked bodies, the decapitated people, and so forth. So I think I felt disappointed, and as you know, because as I explain in the book, then I did follow up on it with a member of staff.
And what did they say to you?
Uh, Okay, she wasn't particularly receptive. She said, you just got to the school, perhaps wait and see some more of what we're doing, some more of our efforts, and so forth. However, she did acknowledge that there were some other students, two other students from that region in Africa that was being discussed in the assembly, who also approached her and expressed their disappointment as well. So I was happy to know that I wasn't alone in that feeling.
And that particular incident involved a film called Coney 2012, and there was a controversy that happened after that film was screened. There's a few incidences, too, in the book where it seems as if people get their backs up when they are called racist, or even in the book you write about situations where you say white people and there's this kind of reaction. I think it's maybe easier for people to say black people than it is to say white people. Did you find that, how did you navigate all that? Because you have a certain type of poise and confidence that I don't know if many other people at your age would have.
Yeah, that's very true. And I know many people are uncomfortable with some of those terminologies, even certain black people. I remember being on the train once with a friend, and we were having a discussion about race, and she had to say white, and she lowered her voice and she kind of whispered it. She's like, white. And I was thinking, just say what you have to say. It's not, so long as what you're saying isn't offensive to anyone. We should all stretch ourselves. We should all be open to growth, to learning. This is what they teach us in Canadian society. This is what they teach us in the workplace. Workplaces now, they talk about EDI and so forth. The schools, they talk about growth, fostering intellectual curiosity, and so forth. But, is it true if when you want to have certain critical discussions, certain meaningful discussions, people start acting foolishly, so so that's rather annoying. But ultimately, I say people need to be open to expanding themselves, to growth. And if they're uncomfortable with something, they need to confront their discomfort and ask themselves why they're uncomfortable. They really need to, interrogate that discomfort within themselves,
You found the curriculum problematic in one instance, using the example of studying The Great Gatsby in English class. The Great Gatsby is considered one of the greatest books ever written. What's in that book that many people might not realize?
Okay, so let me just go back to grade 11, grade 12 English for a minute and think about it. I think some of, in the book, the way racism is spoken about, or scientific racism, or the superiority of the white races, because there's talk about that, something along those lines, like the superiority of the white races and the white race being pushed out and so forth. So, inherently, perhaps the author's intention was to shed light, or was to bring up a certain topic. And I don't think it's necessarily problematic that students read it, but I do think everything needs to be taught in a context. And I think when dealing with material that is so racially sensitive or so racially charged, teachers really need to do a great job of contextualizing, because you have to understand that the readers in grade 11 or grade 12, they're very young, and they might not have all the tools to properly understand or make sense of some of that content, if it is of a very racially charged nature, like I said earlier.
And your teachers didn't do that?
No, not exactly. I don't feel they did. I felt that we just read certain passages without background, and I needed there to be more background.
Especially if you're a Black student reading that in class, and if you're one of the few Black people in that group, I always got the sense that people were kind of like looking at you, like, and that's defining who you are as an individual. Did you feel that?
Perhaps they were. And, as I document in the book, there were certain experiences that were really hard or that were very uncomfortable for me. I felt a lot of pressure. I felt very demoralized at times. So on the one hand, there was all that. But on the other hand, there was me marching to the beat of my own drum, completely marching to the beat of my own drum. And I feel that that's something I've had all throughout life. And I'm very happy about that. So on the other hand, I think there was just a sense of me being like, I'm here to do what I need to do. And
yeah, one of your teachers said to you that when you graduated, that she loved it when you came to class because you were just like this bright light, and you were just, like you said, going by the beat of your own drum. So I want to read another passage that you write in the book. You write, considering the pervasiveness of whitewashing and the racism that pervades media, advertising, education, and social culture, I would argue that deep psychological intervention is necessary for white individuals to have a paradigm shift with respect to how they view Black people. What did you mean by that?
So, similar to what I said earlier when I talk about the whitewashing, so the billboards and the movies and the TV programs and the magazines, this is something we've all grown up with, or something that's been so normalized for all people, Black, white, for people of all races, that whiteness is normalized and everything else is somehow different, let's just put it that way. And that the white experience is the normal experience, it's the standard, it's the default experience. Every time we turn on our TV, that's what we're told. Every time we open a magazine, every time we read a novel, you can read novels written by other authors, but generally speaking, it's novels, they reflect the white experience. In school, when we read books, that's what we're told, that the white experience is the standard, is the default experience. So there's been that pervasiveness, and our teachers, say many white educators, they've grown up with that pervasiveness, and they've just accepted it as the normal experience. And sometimes when I talk to white people, or I do certain sessions, or I have interviews on this topic, many of them, they're very appreciative, but they're also surprised about the extent to which we as Black people, or the amount of time and energy, rather, I should say, we as Black people put into dealing with racism. And then, when we take it home, or when we have to be talking to our friends or family members about it, it's just so much energy, I think, so much of our energy that could be used toward something else, toward writing another book, for example. So then, as a result, to change some of that, there needs to be a deep psychological intervention, so much unlearning, So when we talk about these EDI initiatives or trainings for staff, this is some of the unlearning that has to happen, because we've all been conditioned for so long, for centuries actually, to believe that whiteness is normal, whiteness is the default, and everything else is different, is problematic, is all the thoughts that are associated with everything that's non-white. So that's what I mean in that passage.
You also write in the book that this is actually harming white students when we do, so we need to kind of rethink it, because white students are not benefiting from this either. What did you mean by that?
No, they're not, because it can engender a kind of narcissism. That's the first word that comes to mind. It can engender a kind of narcissism, a kind of living in a bubble, a kind of seeing the world through a singular lens, through the lens of your experience only, when the world is, again, to use that corny word, a melting pot of experiences, a melting pot of cultures, a melting pot of races. So it does harm white students. And sometimes when they're forced out of that bubble, or when they're forced out of that bubble, it can be difficult for them. That's why to speak of what you mentioned earlier, people sort of backing up against a wall or becoming defensive when you talk about racism or when you talk about whiteness. That's it. Sometimes it's that discomfort. It's their foundation is being challenged. It's everything they've learned is being challenged, and it comes with the kind of defensiveness, even hostility. I've seen it come with hostility. I'm sure you have as well. So no, it doesn't benefit white students either.
Well, you dedicated the book to all the Black high schoolers and students of the world, and you said rise up. Your mom is Afua Cooper. She teaches at Dalhousie University. She's a historian, novelist, and she's been on this program many times before. You also wrote about how you understand why Black students might drop out from high school. Do you think you would have been able to push back the way that you did if you didn't have your mom's support and guidance?
Yes and no. It's a great question, and I'm very grateful to have been brought up in a very nourishing home environment. I was brought up with a rich sense of culture, a rich sense of who I am. So this greatly contributed to my sense of self-worth and to my sense of value in a world and in a country and in an environment that is constantly telling you that you don't have value, that is constantly telling you that you're worthless. And as I say this, I'm so aggrieved because this is the harm, this is the violence that I really hope people will begin to understand that happens to Black kids day in, day out. But anyways, so yes and no, she definitely did encourage me and helped to give me that sense of confidence. But the pressure is so great. So sometimes even having that sense of confidence or coming from a family environment that encourages you, that gives you a great sense of culture, is not enough. Sometimes the pressure alone, the violence of racism, that in itself can erode any confidence that you might have received at home. And I know other Black students or other Black people who have grown up in an environment similar to my own, and frankly, they didn't make it. They just didn't make it. That's the pressure of the society. That's the violence of racism. It eroded them. So yes and no. And while it's great, and while I do encourage all parents of Black children to really lift up their children at home, to boost them, to so forth, instill a sense of value and so forth into them, I really, it's not enough, and there needs to be more than just telling those parents to do that, because it's really not enough, and it's a lot on the parents too.
Well, I totally agree. I have two small kids, and my son, the older that he gets, the more worried I become. There's only so much I can do at home, but once he goes out into the larger world, there's very few things that I can control. But Habiba, thank you so much for sharing your journal with us. Thank you for putting it into a book, and congratulations on all of your success. We really do appreciate you taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Nam. It was my pleasure.
An unexpected phone call to Confederation College solved a decades-old mystery about two paintings by the renowned artist Norval Morrisseau. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwest for Ontario hubs, and she joins us now from Thunder Bay to explain. Hello there.
Hi, Jan.
All right, for those who are not familiar with the late Norval Morrisseau, you can tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, so Norval Morrisseau has a pretty impressive CV. He founded the Woodland School of Art. He was a member of the Indian Group of Seven, and he was also the first Indigenous artist in Canada to have his work featured at a mainstream art gallery. And so it's for those reasons that Carmen Robertson, who is an art historian and an expert on Norval Morrisseau, who I spoke to for the story, she calls Morrisseau the Mishomis, or the grandfather of contemporary Indigenous art. And as Carmen explained to me, Morrisseau was born in Fort William in 1931. He was sent to live with his grandparents on Sandpoint Reserve, which is today called Bingwe Nayashi and Anishinaabe, which is a small community on the shores of Lake Nipigon. And that's really where Morrisseau learned about Indigenous spirituality and Catholicism, these themes that would go on to influence his work. And, despite his credentials, he never actually received any formal art training. As a young person, he worked various jobs in Northwestern Ontario, like highway construction and pulpwood cutting. And he also got a job at a gold mine in Red Lake, which is where he began meeting other artists who taught him about various European art traditions and also supported his work as an artist. So within about a decade, beginning in the 1960s through the 1970s, Morrisseau found commercial success as an international artist with exhibitions in not only Canada, but the US and Europe. And the rest really is history.
All right, I want to talk about two paintings, Demigod 1 and Demigod 2. These two paintings were donated to the Confederation College in Thunder Bay in the 1970s and then stolen from this lobby in 1981. What exactly happened here?
Yeah, so that photo was taken in the 70s, I believe, but you can see the paintings there in the foyer. And based on news reports, shortly after the theft, it appears that two young people walked into the college, and everyone at the college sort of thought that they were there working, perhaps removing the paintings so they could move them to another part of the building, which apparently was not uncommon at that time. But eventually people caught on when they realized the paintings were missing. They were no longer in the building. And, it's been a long time, but no one's been arrested in relation to these thefts. However, spokesperson for the Thunder Bay Police Service says the investigation remains ongoing. However, after the theft, we know from court documents that the paintings made their way to an art gallery in Montreal, which no longer exists. And it was there from that art gallery in 1981, the same year the paintings went missing, that a Montreal-based lawyer and art collector purchased the paintings for $7,000, which, according to court documents, he didn't know were stolen until 2018.
All right, so take us to where we are now. We sort of know that these paintings have sort of resurfaced. How exactly did they sort of come about?
Yeah, so I spoke to Mike Rosig, who works in public safety at Confederation College, and he told me shortly after he started his job there in 2018, he got a phone call from an art curator. And the art curator told him that she was aware of two Norval Morrisseau paintings for sale in Montreal. And she was also aware that these paintings had been stolen from the college decades earlier in 1981. And Mike wasn't really sure what to make of that at first because he had no idea that these paintings were stolen in the first place. But, being a former police officer, he used his investigative experience to track down the photograph that we saw of the paintings from the college in the 1970s. And then he got in touch with local police, who ultimately put him in touch with the police in Quebec, who were able to confirm that the paintings in Montreal were in fact the same paintings that were stolen from the college in the 1980s.
Now, we should mention that a deal was made. Those paintings are now in this province. They are back where they sort of belong, and they were donated to the local gallery there. We have a photo of a more recent photo of those paintings, Demigod 1 and Demigod 2. Tell us what we're looking at here.
That's right. Yeah. So in reporting for the story, I got to go to the art gallery and meet with Sharon Godwin, who is the lady in that photo. And she's the director of the art gallery. And, she explained that it's important that these pieces are back here because of their history. They belong in this region where Morrisseau did a lot of his work and lived a lot of his life, right? As opposed to being in a private collector's collection hanging in their house where, not a lot of people get the opportunity to see them.
Charnel, very important story and very interesting story as well. Thank you so much for your time. And I should mention, for more on Norval Morrisseau, to check out our Art of Sovereignty podcast that explores the lives of 8 First Nation artists. Thanks again, Charnel.
Thank you.
And that is tonight's agenda in the summer. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again next time.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.